All right, well then I'm going to go ahead and start recording so that we can get started with our wonderful session today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Megan Jones is a social scientist and facilitator working in environmental conservation. Her research focuses on understanding and supporting the actions individuals take to make the systems they are embedded in more sustainable and just. Her facilitation focuses on helping groups of scientists and practitioners come together to address complex problems. And Amanda Cravens is a research social scientist with the US Geological Survey's Social and Economic Analysis branch. She works on a range of interdisciplinary environmental topics, as well as actionable science and creativity in science. So we are very, very lucky and fortunate to have Megan and Amanda join us today to talk about articulating the value and practice of science facilitation. So thank you so much, you both.
Thanks, Christine. We're both really excited to be here and talk about this topic with an audience that really has thought deeply about aspects of what we're talking about.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. And thank you all so much for being here. It's great to see the interest in these topics and the ongoing participation in this webinar series. It's really fun to see the conversation continue to evolve each month, and really looking forward to delving into this topic with you all today and having a kind of both, we're going to share some stuff and want to hear from you all and have some discussion and interactivity to it. Next slide, please, Amanda. Thank you. So I'm really excited about science facilitation in the context of Interreach, because I think this goes for Amanda as well, it's really about bringing people together in ways that are greater than the sum of the parts, which is, I know, a big part of what the Interreach community tries to do. And speaking of that, this is part 3 of that webinar series that Christine mentioned at the beginning. So we've already heard from a couple of our colleagues introducing the concept of facilitation and sort of unpicking really what that can look like. And then in September, some other folks talked about what some of the interactive strategies that can make facilitation really effective. And we're going to be building on that in our talk today, thinking about what facilitation is and what subsets of facilitation might look like, and how to make it really, bring our facilitator hats to this webinar as well. So Sarah and Anne talked in September about how you should, one practice of webinars is to have some form of interactivity every 7 minutes to keep people feeling engaged and having fun. So we're going to try and stick as close to that as we can today as well. And then just wanted to show these others up on the board here as well for you all to think about upcoming talks that might build off of what we're going to be talking about today, including equitable and inclusive facilitation, and then compassionate and resilient community work in the next couple of months to round out 2020. So that is my intro, and then Amanda and I are going to do a lot of ping-ponging back and forth, so you'll hear us doing that, but hopefully it goes smoothly. Over to you, Amanda.
Sorry, jumped the gun a bit on the slide there. So the work that we're going to share today belongs to more than just me and Megan. And as I think all of you know, that's almost always the case when you're building theory. But we want to most immediately acknowledge the other 3 authors of the paper that this comes through from, and that paper is just about ready to be submitted. And there's 3 other co-authors who you can see here, Hannah, Courtney, and Jill, and who may or may not be online. And so when we get to the question thing, they may have things to add. I can't see all the attendees right now, but more broadly, the ideas that we're putting into this paper have come from conversations that all of us have had over quite a long period of time with other facilitator practitioner colleagues, and some folks we want to acknowledge by name: Sarah Stevens, Anne Herberger Marino, Elisa Stevens, Carrie Capel, and then our ongoing engagement with this community over a period of time. So thank you. And thank you to all of you who are joining this conversation today. And so, as I've already hinted, this work came out of lived experience. And then we started consciously reflecting on our experiences and figuring out how and why things we'd done in the past or seen other people do worked or didn't work, and why. And what we're doing today is inviting you to join some of this conscious reflection process. So for those of you who work with interdisciplinary teams, which I think is a lot of the audience, given InterReach's purpose, this is a chance to think about the thinking that you do in those settings, or what learning scientists call metacognition. As I mentioned, this is work on a paper that's just about finished. And because of that, and because of academic norms, we want to make sure that we give credit where it's due as we invite you to join us in our thinking today. We plan to acknowledge InterReach and this talk in the paper. And if you make a comment either in the chat or out loud and you want your name associated with it, or you have published work that makes that point, just please make sure to mention it in the chat, or if it's more comfortable, send us an email and we'll make sure that we either cite it or associate your name with it when we finish up this paper. And just kind of a reminder that Christine already mentioned, we have the office hour session next week, same time, that different Zoom link, to continue the conversation in more depth than there'll likely be time for today. So those logistics out of the way, want to just start with a little bit of like who you are. And so Megan's going to start with one of those interactive moments.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, as we are coming together to refine and find this theory of what science facilitation is, what we can use it for, how we do it, when we should use it. We want to have this be a collaborative space, which means making this a space that we all feel comfortable participating in. So one of the first things we'd like, starting here with a softball question for you to share in the chat. What's the longest you have ever kept a plant alive? Or if you've got non-plant pets, if you have a pet, what is one of their eccentric behaviors? And so we'd love to hear from all of you in the chat feature what your answer to one of these questions about either how long you've kept a plant alive, or what's an eccentric behavior of a pet that you have, and maybe clarify what kind of pet you're talking about, because that would determine what eccentric counts as. "18 years. I think Marissa might have come in at the top with a record. 23 years.
23. Ooh, 30.
I'm with you, Allie, on a year and a half for a plant. That feels like a victory in the moment.
We have some really social dogs who are going out visiting.
This is great. I love it. I love calling a cat a pigeon, having a cat named Pigeon too. I think that is fantastic. We put a couple photos here of our own answers to these questions. The air plant is mine, and it just flowered last week, and I felt like that was a total victory moment. I've had that plant for like 4 years, and it's gone through various stages of nearly alive, nearly dead, to now it's at its happiest it's ever been. So, and these puppies are Amanda's.
These puppies are the two who basically have me very well trained after the pandemic. They actually react to the Microsoft Teams and the Zoom like chime at the end. And it's this Pavlovian thing of jump up. And now they've backed it up to when I say, well, thank you, which apparently I say in the same tone when I end a meeting. And then they jump up. I saw two clown loaches like to sleep under a rock next to each other. So even the fish are getting along well.
Yes, we've got the whole gamut. That's great. Thank you all. And please keep comments flowing in the chat as we go today, ping-ponging off of anything we're saying as we talk, as well as in the interactive moments. So back to you, Amanda.
Thanks. So the sort of place we started with the argument that we're sharing with you today, and this will probably not be a surprise to most of you, because this is one of the things that, InterReach is thinking a lot about, is the science we're doing today is different. My grandfather actually was a professor of biochemistry who studied chickens. He got his PhD in 1940. And you can actually look some of his papers up in Google Scholar. They've got really primitive graphs because they did the stats by hand. And that's far from the only way that modern science has evolved. And there's a couple of points that I just want to call to attention because it's really important for what we're talking about today. It's more collaborative. We know that. There's more authors on each paper. There's more institutions. And this is what gets called team science. And as many of you are aware and working in, that's led to the science of team science, which is addressing the implications of this increasingly collaborative science. But to really boil this whole field of literature down to a couple of key points, I want us to take a step back and think about what that means that science is done in interdependent teams. So point number one, working in scientific teams is hard and complex. For a lot of you, that's kind of an oh duh. Basically, no one who's been on a team that struggled is going to argue with that. But I want us to reflect on why it's so hard. And the reason we've been thinking about why it's so hard is that effective scientific collaboration really requires multiple levels of teamwork to be happening simultaneously. We've been using a metaphor of a rope or a braid, and it becomes one strong integrated whole when the individual strands are woven together. And conversely, if one strand is missing or it becomes frayed, you have a danger that the whole thing might unravel. And so I just want to look at each of these strands individually for a moment. The first strand is the interpersonal. And this strand is about people, relationships, emotions, group dynamics. The interdependent nature of team science means that effective interactions between group members are intimately related to the scientific success of these types of projects. And then one key concept I want to mention that comes originally from organizational behavior, although people have brought it into team science, is psychological safety. And that means that in order to do effective science, the team has to be a safe place for members to be vulnerable, to share ideas in progress, to ask questions that allow each person to learn. But in order to learn, you have to ask questions that reveal what you don't know right now to other group members. The second strand is the intellectual, and this is about the science itself and about the cognitive processes that produce it. The goal of scientific collaboration is to do science, to produce new knowledge, to build theory, to solve real-world problems. And like any scientific process, this requires defining a research question, defining methods to answer it, identifying or collecting data, analyzing data, producing products, translating results to people who can use them. In team science settings, the process of creating and sharing new knowledge is the collective responsibility of that interdependent team of scientists. And so as a result, the process of developing, refining, and implementing group ideas often requires navigating many of those aspects of the research process with other team members. And in settings, and this second point is something I know a lot of you have written about, in settings where team members have different core assumptions about research, this gets called interdisciplinarity, this gets called transdisciplinarity. People are referring to it as convergence research sometimes. But in settings where people have different core assumptions about what research is, what its purpose is, what good research looks like, they may be different disciplines, it might be bridging science and practice. There's more cognitive complexity because the team members are also having to negotiate what it means to even do research, how it should be done, and examine their foundational philosophical assumptions. And then that third strand really works in support of the other two. As teams are working, they have to organize resources to do their work, time, money, equipment. And as their work proceeds, they have to take on time management tasks, like assigning work to team members, making sure that the individual tasks and the project overall moves forward. So you've got this kind of complex collaborative process that's moving on multiple levels. And facilitation has been suggested as a really useful tool for managing scientific collaboration. We believe that's true, partly. But facilitation in its general form, the way that Hannah and Courtney presented it in the first of these webinars, we also believe is only part of the solution. At its most simple definition, facilitation is practice-based expertise that helps optimize interpersonal dynamics in a group. I know there's some other uses of the word facilitation. This is taking sort of the broadest definition, and probably what I would argue is the most widespread. Facilitators usually work in real time. They become the guide or guardian of the team's interests as opposed to the individuals, and their task or charge is to help the group as a whole do its best work. But really, facilitation is, its sweet spot is solving the challenges within that interpersonal braid. Things like personality conflicts, creating that psychological safety, setting expectations. There may also be a role that facilitators are paying attention to things in that resources and logistics braid of helping teams decide together how to accomplish tasks. General facilitation expertise says nothing specific about doing this work in scientific settings because it ignores how the intellectual strand of the braid interacts with the interpersonal, which is where we've come to focus on what we are calling science facilitation. So we argue that we need a form of facilitation that explicitly accounts for the interaction between the cognitive, intellectual, and the interpersonal that happens in science collaborations. Basically, we're saying that to facilitate science collaboration and that interaction effectively, there's two distinct forms of knowledge you need to draw on. Understanding how science collaboration happens and understanding all of the things that general facilitation has as its sweet spot. And I'll just briefly point out that the purple box says the role of the scientific facilitator. We conceptualize a scientific facilitator as someone who's playing a particular role within a group doing team science, not as a person who might have that job title professionally. The reason that's important, Megan is going to explain in detail. Two more points here, just want to make. So before I present the formal definition that our group is proposing, I want to just pause for a second and talk about how we believe a person develops expertise in scientific facilitation. So, like general facilitation, we see science facilitation as a form of practice-based expertise. So following Donald Schoen, who was one of the foundational theorists of reflective practice and developed double loop learning, and describing what expertise consists of when you break it down, we see expertise as developing through two related reflective processes. Schoen's theory says the way that you develop practice-based expertise, there's this metaphor that you have a mental filing cabinet of experiences in your head that you can draw on when you're thinking and acting in the world. And so when a person serves in the role of facilitator for a scientific team, you know, okay, there's this meeting that I'm facilitating. Some things go great, some things go not so great. Both kinds of experiences get filed into my mental filing cabinet as I learn from them. And then I'm also filing away, okay, my understanding of the circumstances that created those experiences. That process is what Schoen calls reflection on action. And then later, when I'm facilitating a new team and a situation comes up that reminds me of that past situation, I flip through my mental filing cabinet and I pull out that little bit of insight. And that helps me decide, okay, how am I going to respond in the moment that's maybe different from how I responded before to maybe help this current situation go better. Colloquially, sometimes this gets called thinking on your feet. Technically, Schoen calls it reflection in action. Both of these together, reflection in action and on action, are aspects of metacognition, which is that bigger process that I mentioned earlier of thinking about your thinking to learn. And both of them are the reason that the more experience someone has serving in the facilitator role for scientific teams, the more ability that he or she likely has to understand what is happening, why it's happening, and thus weave together those different strands of the braid and know how to respond to help the group do its work effectively. Which brings us to this definition that we're proposing in this paper. So our definition has 3 parts. We define science facilitation as a role within a scientific team that is best filled by someone who uses a distinct form of practice-based expertise to guide teams in the process of scientific collaboration. And as I already mentioned, that expertise combines an understanding of scientific collaboration and general facilitation expertise. I've already explained the importance of part 1 and part 2 of this definition. We're going to take a short interactive interlude here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Megan, who's going to go into depth about the first part of that role and why we define it that way. So, interaction, we're going to take about 2 minutes, invite you to share in the chat, or if anyone wants to unmute and share. Think of a time that you've worked with a scientific team. This could be in a role that was a leader or facilitator role, or as a team member. What sorts of expertise did you find most important for your collaborative process? And or, how have you seen the intellectual and interpersonal aspects of collaboration interact? And I'm trying to figure out where the start of my chat here is.
And specifically, we've sort of shared these three strands of the braid about intellectual, interpersonal, and logistics and resources expertise. I'm seeing some comments in the chat about that maybe relate to that. Has anyone found that they have really that resonates, that like one of those forms of expertise has been most important for you in collaboration? Or have you found that you have been bringing the interpersonal and intellectual together a lot in your work in these scientific collaboration spaces?
Also open to skeptical comments because I'm hearing a lot of silence. Thanks, Sharon. I'm just beginning to bring out the interpersonal aspects to teams I support. It takes a long time. Jeff, often scientists need to be invited to talk through turn taking. This feels like both interpersonal and the intellectual. I think that's a good point, Jeff. Like, where do we draw the line between those? And like any conceptual framework, it's simpler to divide it when you're thinking about it sometimes than in an actual room. Hesitancy in speaking up, hierarchies. Yeah, Jenny, great point. Emotional maturity. The interpersonal can actually help the intellectual. So some great points there. I know I've just also thrown a lot at you there. These are some wonderful comments in the chat. Did anyone want to say anything to the group out loud before I turn it over to Megan here?
I think I'm unmuted right now.
Yep.
And the point that I wanted to make about this, that I guess also brings the idea of the facilitator into the conversation, is sometimes people aren't, this idea of, not everybody feels comfort with speaking up. They need to build trust or whatever in the group. And so as a facilitator, or in my experience with teams, if you model the speaking up to ask questions, I think that, then that gives people that maybe haven't participated in the conversation a little bit more impetus to participate as well.
Christine, I think that's a really great point. And I think that's an example of how we are separating out the strands of the braid, because that example of creating space for people to speak up who don't feel comfortable is something that happens in very, very different facilitation settings. Helping people feel comfortable speaking up when they're giving public comment in environmental conflict resolution, helping employees speak up if there's a workplace dispute. I think that challenge, we certainly experience it in scientific settings, but a lot of our argument is that a lot of the expertise we're drawing on to address it is not science specific. And so that's how we're separating out, whereas more of the intellectual piece we see as some of the things around some of the tools that people in this community and beyond have developed for how do you address differences in epistemology, for example. That's something you're unlikely or less likely to have to do if you're doing a workplace dispute, for example, or developing a strategic plan with employees. So it's not a bright line, but that's how we're thinking about the distinction. I want to I think there's some great points here. We can come back to them a little bit later, but I don't want to take too much of Megan's time. So I'm going to turn it over to Megan.
I'm just loving the rich discussion that has almost exploded in the chat feature. It's clear that many of you are engaging, like Christine, you just said, engaging in this practice on a day-to-day of trying to bring in just taking the intellectual and the interpersonal and where those lines end and blending them together. And that really gets at the fact that scientific collaboration is a journey that goes over long periods of time, often with groups and different groups, and maybe groups coming together in bigger groups. So there's different ways that you can think about bringing that facilitation expertise into that process over time and at different stages of a scientific group coming together, which is why we've created this next section that I'm going to talk about here, of these different, we sort of boiled it down to 3 paths of facilitation, the facilitator role, because these are the questions that we have to kind of unpack together. And in our teams is, how do you operationalize this expertise? How do we develop the ability to do this in practice? And what forms of expertise do we need to bring in when, and who needs to have that expertise in what moment? Someone said something about graduate students. Several people talked about power hierarchies and how that can shape group dynamics. And it also brings in our own backgrounds of experience as working and doing interdisciplinary work across different knowledge systems and the context we navigate. So these paths aren't prescriptive per se, they're more like a way to help start a conversation about which forms of expertise can come in at different spaces. Next slide, Amanda. So the first path is one that maybe might jive with some of your own experience, kind of getting more into some of the work that Interreach does if you identify as a scientist yourself, which is that a leader within a scientific team might develop their own facilitation expertise and take on the role of the scientific facilitator in their team that they're working on. And in that case, they're really generally you would expect them to be strongest in their understanding of the scientific collaboration component of this piece, that they are really higher on the intellectual and maybe logistics and resources expertise, like they might be really strong on some of the relevant theory and methods, potentially with a particular disciplinary lens. They may be someone who has helped resource the project, helped get funding for the project to happen, so they have some of that expertise as well. but they may have less experience, some of you kind of pointed at in your in the chat of that interpersonal expertise, less of that reflective practice about group dynamics, that reflection in and on action and metacognition. So there are different pros and cons to each of these kinds of paths. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, and not necessarily hard or fast rules, but you might think about trying to bring more facilitation expertise into your teams. This model, path one, can potentially be a lower cost approach for some initial facilitation, science facilitation, especially if the scientist has previous training in facilitation expertise, like they've been actively cultivating their understanding of interpersonal dynamics and how to manage them. It might be more emergent from the group as needed, especially if people are wearing multiple hats in their work in the team. So it could come in at key moments that are more organic to the process. But then, like I said, there's this risk that if you're looking to the scientists who are already within the team to facilitate the scientific collaboration, that they may not have that interpersonal expertise at a high enough level to really steer the process well at all times. It could be slow things down if you try and find that training for people in the course of a project that's already underway. And then there's also this role piece that Amanda referred to, like facilitation is a skill set, but it's also a role. And if you are contributing as a scientist already to an interdisciplinary process, it can be a challenge to kind of bring in some of the neutrality that an external facilitator might bring in. So we think that there may be this path one might tend to work best in places where your team is perhaps already small, or is has less interdisciplinary complexity. So people kind of already understand each other more and understand the core assumptions and share more of the core assumptions. And maybe the team is already working well together. So there's less of that interpersonal conflict. Exigency, you simply don't have the budget to hire an external facilitator. But if you do, there's the second path available, which is what Amanda referred to earlier, which is this growing recognition that we can bring in general facilitation expertise to help with scientific collaboration and complement the scientific expertise of the group. But when you are often, what we're seeing is that sometimes when people are hiring, facilitators to help with scientific collaboration, those folks don't necessarily have the experience of working within scientific teams or the training and understanding in scientific collaboration and that kind of intellectual foundation of how different disciplines tend to think about how we know what we know and how we go about learning things and what the purpose of science is, or what we are trying to achieve with it, or how we can do it. And so there are slightly different pros and cons here, sort of inverse to path one, that you might have greater facilitation expertise and greater neutrality than scientists who are embedded within a team. And facilitation, general facilitators might be more widely available than tailored scientific facilitators, but there is that potential for higher costs that are than if you're drawing on internal capacity within the team already. And the real risk, as Amanda was sort of unpacking earlier, that general facilitators might not understand how scientific teams work. And if that happens, or when that happens, it can lead to a potentially mismatched experience if you are looking to an external facilitator to have the relevant knowledge of how to help this team move forward, and they don't have all of the pieces of the puzzle. And so they end up maybe slowing down or confusing things because they don't fully get what the scientists are bringing to the table, which could even lead to backlash against the idea of that we don't need facilitation at all if these facilitators don't even understand how we need to work. But like for path one, there may be use cases for this depending on your context and what you're doing. So things that might, if your issues are around in a team are around those interpersonal dynamics. So you've got bigger teams, bigger groups of people where there's more going on socially, or teams that haven't worked together before, or that have latent conflict, especially maybe interpersonal conflict. that might be really helpful to just bring in this external facilitators. Or if you have important planning meetings that are more like strategic planning that might be less specific to science and more just project management type stuff. And the third path, though, is the one that we think not necessarily the only right answer, but an answer to problems that people might be living with and not realizing that there is even this option that you can think about a science facilitator who has experience working with scientific teams as that external facilitator, but who combines those two different forms of scientific and facilitation expertise. And so the pros of that would be that they would have more facilitation expertise than the scientists. Next slide, Amanda. Thank you. And maybe more neutrality in a scientific process than people who are embedded within the team. But then more scientific expertise, more understanding of how to navigate different core scientific assumptions than facilitators who haven't worked in a scientific space, which can potentially lead to difficulties around finding and affording the right kind of science facilitator, depending on where your project is coming from funding-wise, and also if you need very specific forms of scientific domain competence, like people who understand restoration ecology or atmospheric chemistry, or both of those things, and facilitation. That's when it starts to get, you might need a very specific kind of facilitator. But then, and ideally in this case, then you can have the facilitators who can handle, science facilitators can handle teams of bigger teams and maybe smaller teams, helping steer that longer term process, like Christine was talking about, different moments in the process, or helping with teams that haven't worked together before, or that have complexity, or especially that conflict over scientific assumptions that really might be beyond the expertise of a non-science facilitator. And I'm just going to pause here for a second because I'm seeing some great comments in the chat that I want to bring in. So Kim said, for path one, I don't know that there is necessarily less interpersonal conflict, but that the team and the facilitator know where the landmines are and have some ability to function within those boundaries. So I think that's a great point, that in all of this stuff, there's so many different forms of expertise that we're talking about. Knowing what your limitations are is crucial for interdisciplinary work. Aparna said, there's not only a mismatch in the lack of science knowledge, there can also be a mismatch if the science team doesn't understand the differences in facilitator skill sets. I'd love to hear more about that too. And Amanda, feel free to jump in here at any point.
Yeah, I'd add, Aparna, I think we agree entirely, and that's one of the things we're doing here with path 2 and path 3, is pointing out that there are differences, and that it's something a team might want to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gemma's point kind of gets to the question that maybe on the next slide, Amanda, you can see we wanted to, and actually Osnat's point about combining paths 1 and 2, thinking about which of these paths have you used and what's happened and what's worked well or less well, and thinking about these different models. Someone, that point Osnat made about you can combine paths depending on where you are in your project. You can divert from one to another. Gemma's point about having to do groundwork within a team before you bring in external facilitators being really important, so that you have that kind of buy-in within the team as well. And Christine's point, saying that she's living in a fourth scenario, the need to develop scientific facilitation expertise through my work, reading, etc., given my position helping scientific teams to develop complex proposals over long time periods. So Christine, I'm curious, is that so that you're talking more about like the person who is the funder, or like working with the project development, not necessarily in the team it's day to day, but setting up this space for this to work?
So we're part of what might be weekly or bi-weekly meetings over a year and a half, working with the team as they, try and develop a complex and competitive proposal. So I'm not trained as a facilitator, but I feel like a lot of the things that you talk about are things that I've been learning over the last several years through reflection on articles in team science and ways in which to manage groups of people and things like that.
Absolutely.
So what I hear there, Christine, and I mean, when you put out a framework, sometimes it won't make sense to shoehorn everything into it. But what I hear thinking about your experience is that maybe you started working with things a number of years ago, sort of as someone acting in path 1, and you've been kind of transitioning to someone acting in path 3 as you build that expertise and that kind of, the science piece, as you develop greater expertise in your own facilitation expertise.
I can understand where you're coming from. Totally.
Well, I would be curious if anyone wants to share in the chat or unmute, just reflecting on whether paths 1, 2, or 3 feel more familiar to you, more like that they've worked better or worse for you. Any reflections on which of these paths feel you have experience going down as a group, and how they've worked, if anyone wants to share. Sharon, I see you've unmuted.
So I'm going to kind of echo Christine, and I think I'm echoing what you say in terms of transitioning from pathway 1 to maybe pathway 3. So I work in research development in Tennessee, and it was the PI facilitating the team without skills, today's skills anyway. It was more the grandfather's leadership, research, the old fashioned autocratic. So through InterReach and other things, I'm learning a skill set, a beginner's skill set, to then take to a PI like that. And he's developed enough trust through the work we've done over time to let us go places, like bring collaborative planning to him, bring some team building exercises to the team, et cetera. So that's kind of where I'm at. I love learning about what you all are doing and applying it, but I don't see yet our institution bringing in that path 3. It's almost like we're on the job training to become that path 3. Just, we have the years of experience just being in the academic setting. That alone gives us some insights into their scientific processes and what have you. Could be better though.
Megan, can I back up a slide and make a point?
Of course. And then I want to get Jenny's voice in because I saw they unmuted.
Sure. Sharon, I absolutely hear you. And I think, actually it's 2 slides. This is part of what I was pointing to when we are talking about the role of the scientific facilitator and bringing these 2 bodies of expertise in. We're not saying that path 3, I guess, and this is actually a really good point, because we've named it as hiring external scientific facilitators. I think we probably need to think about that name. Because I think the spirit of what we really have been thinking about here is that role is being played by somebody who has a balanced set of expertise in both of these areas. I guess the case we'd been thinking about the most is that was somebody external, but I think what you're bringing up, and maybe some other folks have been bringing up in the chat, is that maybe it's going to be more likely, given institutional constraints, that it's going to be developing that in-house by slowly building the facilitation expertise of folks who started out with path 1. And I think we need to think about, maybe we do add that as a 4th path, the way Christine was thinking about. Maybe we rename how we talk about this, but I really appreciate those comments. And I know when we were thinking about this, we were thinking less about the fact that this is an external person being hired and more that it's about the balance between the skill set being brought in.
Sorry, go ahead, Jenny.
Hi, excuse me. So I am kind of an in-house 3, but I've been but I'm not a scientist. One of the things I noticed is you noted in the science facilitator, it might, or the external facilitator, it might be hard to find the right domain knowledge. And I'm kind of finding that coming from outside science, but learning the ins and outs of kind of how science gets done and how it gets funded and how to facilitate it, it actually puts me in a good spot to work with interdisciplinary teams who are kind of foreign to each other's concepts a lot of times. But I think having a dedicated in-house role, so you get the familiarity with the individuals and even with their ideas and the projects that they're trying to advance, has its definite advantages. But I still have kind of a neutral position within the teams themselves.
I love this distinction that's emerging between some of this longer term institutional work that some of you are leading versus when facilitation comes in at specific points in a project from an outside perspective, like some of the folks in the chat are talking about consulting and the pros and cons of that. Gemma, go ahead. You were going to add something.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say how the roles evolve. I just give the example, like I'm currently working on an SF-funded growing convergence research project. It's a 5-year project. So in the proposal, I said I'm going to do 2 things. One is I'm going to do the evaluation of network analysis, and one is I'm going to develop a leadership curriculum. I did both. And then, but then my role evolved into facilitation because of the need, right? And I didn't, before we started, I didn't think of, like, I didn't even know what facilitation was, but then it was like a very transdisciplinary project with very diverse expertise. They're just that need that needs to be filled that nobody was thinking of. And then I just gradually evolved into that role. Added the role. So, and then the thing is, another thing I was thinking is a lot of time when we talk about facilitation, like there are skills that to be learned for sure. But the thing is, I think if you have the awareness and then if you have the intention and you have some experience, the skill is actually quite easy to develop, at least in my view. I think what is most hard is the awareness. It's like a lot of the PIs, like they don't realize the way they run their meetings is counterproductive. So it's just my little two cents.
Those are such great points. And I think part of what we're trying to do in opening this conversation with this paper and this talk, and hopefully some of you will join us in office hours to talk more, is to draw more recognition to the forms of expertise that facilitation, involves, like build that awareness, but also build that recognition of that it's not always easy. I think maybe Brian was commented in the chat a long time ago about how is empathy a form of expertise, or how do we talk about this stuff? But recognizing the hard work that can go into bringing groups together, that's much more than just than some of the other parts of science, and getting that value, and then to hopefully getting it more funded as well, to points in the chat feature. I know that we don't have that much longer together for today. Maybe Amanda, if you could just fully load slide 25, the next one. Yeah. Awesome. So this is a question that I would love to have you all just maybe think about in your own work as you move forward, in terms of thinking about signs and signals that you have a mismatch between your project and the path that you're on, and how we can go about evolving and moving to different paths as needed, and bringing in that recognition and developing of the skill sets that are needed at different moments. Because we have talked about I'm sure we can all think of examples in our own lives of when you have no facilitation or bad facilitation in a group that leads to feelings of wasting time or even a failure to produce the necessary scientific outcomes, or even maybe doing bad science because you're not getting to hear from the right people in a team. You know, that could be worst case scenario. Aparna, exactly. Bad facilitation can be worse than no facilitation. And so let's not have bad facilitation if we can get away with it. And so thinking about facilitators needing to ask for feedback on the facilitation early and often and in psychologically safe ways, making sure participants are willing and able to speak out about problems with the process, you know, kind of turning these warning signs or risks into, so what do we do about this, right? And paying attention to when people in a group are getting frustrated or disengaging from a scientific process. And that might be a signal that there's a facilitation mismatch or need that's not being met, that can help bring the group back together so that people are not disengaging or doing bad work or what have you. So a question to think about of just looking out for warning signs and as you do this work or help others do this. And ultimately, next slide, thanks, Amanda. I think that science facilitation can be a form of bridge building to bring not just groups together on these multiple levels that Amanda sort of introduced across the braid, but also to bridge these gaps between people who identify more as facilitators or as scientists, and also these other stakeholders like institutional capacity within universities or science funders to get this recognition of how we can facilitate effective science collaboration across these diverse teams. I don't think we have time to think about thoughts and takeaways, but I want to re-emphasize that we are around. Amanda and I will be probably even just working on the paper during office hours if no one joins us. So please join us for the conversation. I know we'll be watching back over this recording ourselves to pull out some of the nuggets that you all have shared and maybe following up with some of you to make sure that your ideas are credited if we bring them into the final paper, which we'll be submitting shortly. Amanda's shown that here's our emails up on the slide. So please do reach out to us if you want to chat more. And there will be a slight delay this month in getting the presentation recording out because we are trying to get the publication submitted before we share the recording. So please forgive us if there's a delay in the recording. It's not Interreach's fault, it's us. And Amanda, anything else you want to add?
I just want to echo your thank you, Megan. This has been a really beautiful, rich discussion. Yeah, Cheryl, I'll go back to the references. This has been a wonderful discussion. I really appreciate all of you. And if there's pieces that you want to continue, we really invite you next week to join us for the office hours and we can continue that conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. And feel free to unmute yourself now. We do have a couple minutes left if anyone wants to ask a question or add a last minute comment.
Thank you guys so much for sharing this really important work. The conversation was really incredible. You guys had a lot of really great participation and a lot of good ideas coming out here. So thank you guys. Any other questions before we end today?
I was just wondering what presentation template you guys use. It's so beautiful.
That is actually Megan's. It's not a template. This was, a few of them are different designer ones, but a lot of them are just the fact that Megan creates beautiful slides. So
design ideas in Microsoft PowerPoint is my best friend. Love that. Also, vectors are a fun distraction when I should be working.
Vectors. And also, where do you get your images? Just all the images are so compelling.
Yeah, it's a combination of stuff that comes from within Microsoft and the free vectors and images that are available. But
hey, cool. Thank you.
Of course. And thank you all. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Oh, Mary, office hours are next week, same time, different Zoom link. It's in the email that Christine sent out.